So, something that's been making the rounds in financial media lately is the recent tariff threat from US President Donald Trump and the impact that has had on the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar declined from about 72 cents to 69 cents against the US dollar over the past month after having declined from 80 cents back in March of 2022 and from where it was in 2013, where it was roughly equal with the US dollar. Trump wants to impose a sweeping 25% tariff on all Canadian goods crossing the US border effective on February 1st. It's part of a trend towards protectionism that Trump has become known for, and the goal of these tariffs is supposedly to stop the flow of drugs and migrants coming into the US from Canada, which initially struck me as a bit of an odd reason because these aren't really issues that we've been hearing about previously, but the likely reason that Trump is saying this is because it allows him to bypass the updated NAFTA agreement, the USMCA, which was agreed upon last time Trump was in office and is supposed to prevent these kinds of tariffs and allow free trade. But the US is allowed to implement tariffs if they're for national security reasons, and reasons like illegal immigration and drug trafficking would classify as such. Now, if these tariffs are implemented, this would undoubtedly send Canada into a recession. Over 75% of Canada's exports go to the US specifically, which equates to about 440 billion US dollars annually. And given that Canada's GDP last year was about 2.1 trillion, this means that nearly a quarter of Canada's economy comes from exports into the United States. It's been estimated that this would put Canada into a recession by mid 2025, potentially causing up to 1.5 million job losses and a 2.4% decline in GDP. And industries like oil and gas, automotive manufacturing, and mining and minerals would suffer the most, since those are the ones that make up the bulk of Canada's exports to the US. And putting Canada into such a recession would also force the hand of the Bank of Canada. They would likely have to lower interest rates to stimulate the economy, which would further weaken the Canadian dollar because with lower interest rates, fixed income assets in Canada would have lower yields, which makes them less attractive to foreign investors and therefore reduce demand for the Canadian dollar. So a weak Canadian dollar is something that's been a concern for many Canadians for a long time. It's something that we feel not only when we travel to the US and try and purchase US dollars, but it's something that impacts our cost of living. The US is our biggest trading partner, and everything from gas to food would become more expensive under a weaker Canadian dollar, which, needless to say, is something that would concern all Canadians. So in this video, I want to cover what has caused this decline in the Canadian dollar, not just over the past month, but really over the past decade. What has structurally changed about Canada's economy that has led to this decline happening? And then also talk about what scenarios could potentially play out in the future once it becomes time for Trump to actually follow through with these tariff threats. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, my goal of this video is to paint a fulsome picture of the issue at hand. And to do that, I want to go back to first principles for a little bit and talk about what factors contribute to a country's currency gaining or losing in value. Most of what influences a currency's value can be attributed to one thing, and that is the economic prospects of that country. Countries with booming economies receive more capital flows because people want to invest there, and they receive more trade dollars because those countries are producing and exporting more stuff. It's why Canada's currency was so high 10 years ago when oil prices were high and GDP per capita was high. When the economy was doing well, so was the Canadian dollar. And it's why the US dollar has historically been so strong, because of the US's status as the world's reserve currency and also the strength of the US economy. Now, this doesn't explain quite all of it, because another key piece of the puzzle is monetary policy. When a country increases their interest rate, that encourages foreign investors to convert their local currency into the currency of the country that just increase their interest rate so that they can earn that higher yield. So when two countries offer different yields, the one with the higher yield is likely to see their currency rise in value. Right now, US bonds are yielding more than Canadian bonds. And this has generally been the case over the past 10 years. This chart here shows the 10-year yields with the US in purple, and as we can see, the US yields have usually been higher on 10-year bonds. So part of the reason why the Canadian dollar has declined relative to the US dollar is because of this interest rate differential that has largely persisted over the past 10 years. But also, there's some structural changes to Canada's economy that have also transpired over the past 10 years, which has also exacerbated this decline. Going back to the early 2010s, oil prices were very high, specifically heavy crude oil like Western Canadian Select, which is the main type of oil that gets extracted from Canada's oil sands, was valued very highly. This type of oil does require more transporting and refining than other lighter crude oils like Brent or WTI, so it usually trades at a discount to those types of oils. So when oil prices collapsed in 2014, Canada's oil fell more sharply in value than the other types of oils because of this higher production cost. So since oil exports were a significant chunk of Canada's economy 10 years ago, that decline in the oil price led to reduced demand for Canadian exports and therefore less demand for the Canadian dollar. This is what caused the initial decline we can observe in the mid 2010s from being roughly even with the US dollar to about 70 to 80 cents. And then it pretty much stayed there for the next several years while oil prices stayed pretty low. But as you can see, and as I'm sure we all still remember, back in 2022, when the Russia Ukraine war began, oil prices spiked back up. But when this happened, we didn't also see a corresponding spike in the Canadian dollar. So, why did this happen? Well, over the last decade, the shale oil boom really took off in the US, which enabled them to become a net exporter of oil and therefore less reliant on Canada's oil supply. And since Canada sends nearly all of their oil exports into the United States, there wasn't as much demand for the Canadian dollar under these higher oil prices. Now, the solution to this would be to diversify Canada's oil exports away from just being reliant on the United States. But Canada ended up canceling several pipeline projects that would have enabled oil to be sold to non US countries. For example, there was the Northern Gateway pipeline, which would have connected Alberta to a port in British Columbia for international export, but this project was canceled in 2016 due to environmental concerns and also conflicts with the Indigenous community. There was also the Energy East pipeline, which was designed to transport oil from Alberta to Eastern Canada for export into Europe, but this project was canceled in 2017. And now there's the Trans Mountain Expansion, or TMX, which aims at expanding an existing pipeline to British Columbia's coast so that oil can be exported into Asia as well as Europe. And although this project is progressing, it has faced delays and massive cost overruns. It was initially projected to cost 5.4 billion and be done in 2017, but that got all the way up to 34 billion and it was just finished in May of 2024. So these are just a few factors that have led to Canada's economy stagnating on a per capita basis over the past 10 years. And real estate has been the largest contributor to Canada's GDP, and unlike manufacturing goods or oil and gas, you can't export real estate. It's not a sector that generates a lot of demand for the Canadian dollar. And this flow of capital into real estate has led to a sharp increase in household debt in Canada, which is not the sign of a prosperous country that can attract a lot of foreign investment into non real estate related businesses. Real estate just isn't a sector that can drive productivity gains, and a less productive economy is not going to attract foreign investment dollars or export revenue. So a lot has transpired over the past decade, which has really been an unfortunate series of events from a Canadian dollar perspective. But now there's a new challenge that it faces, which are these tariffs that are being suggested by the new Trump administration. At this point, it's still unclear if these tariffs will actually be implemented and to what extent they'll be implemented, or if it's just being used as a negotiation tactic, since USCMA, the current free trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, is due for renegotiation around 2026. If you'll recall, back in 2018, Trump implemented tariffs on Canadian products like steel and aluminum. And the goal of these tariffs was partly US protectionism, but also as leverage over Canada since NAFTA was in the process of being renegotiated back then, which it eventually was. It was replaced by that USMCA, which is still in effect today. And many of the changes that were made to this agreement did go in the favor of the United States. For example, the US got greater access into Canada's dairy market, which is something it had wanted for a long time. The US was now granted a share of 3.6% of Canada's dairy market, and for automobile manufacturing, vehicles are now required to have at least 75% of the vehicle made in either the US, Canada, or Mexico in order for it to be exempt from tariffs, which is up from 62% 2% previously. So once this new trade deal came into effect, the steel and aluminum tariffs were removed right after. So Trump using tariffs on a temporary basis as negotiating leverage is something that he's done before, and this could explain what he's doing right now. And I also want to point out that the market reaction to this tariff announcement so far has been pretty minimal. For example, if we think about what stocks on the Toronto Stock Exchange, so Canadian companies, would be most impacted by the announcement of these tariffs. One at the top of this list would be Magna International, which is Canada's big auto part manufacturer. Majority of this company's revenue is derived from the US, and as we can see, its stock price has barely moved since Trump's announcement. Suncor Energy, one of the bigger oil companies in Canada, also hasn't changed much in value since the announcement. And the two big railway stocks, CP Rail and CN Rail, have also barely changed in value. Now, I'm not trying to argue that this is definitive evidence that these tariffs won't happen because it is still uncertain, but it's possible that these tariffs get pushed back even more, or maybe they only impact a select few goods coming out of Canada. Now, Canada has a few options when it comes to responding to these threats, which all impact the dollar in different ways. One option is a dollar for dollar matching of tariffs with the US if the tariffs impact all Canadian goods. Now, about 75% of Canada's exports go to the US specifically, so this would obviously reduce trade between these countries, and since Canada's economy is far smaller than the US one, the impact to the Canadian dollar would be immediate and significant. For example, when Trump imposed tariffs on just Canadian steel and lumber back in 2018, the currency declined about 4% over the next few months. So since these are sweeping tariffs that are being proposed, the decline would probably be much higher, around 5 to 10%. And a recent article published by ING mentioned that they'd expect it to be around 1.5 Canadian to US dollars under this scenario, which is roughly a 5% decline from where it is right now. Something else that could happen, and is what's most likely to happen based solely on historical precedent, is the tariffs impact select Canadian goods and Canada responds back with similar tariffs. This would still be an unfortunate outcome from a Canadian dollar perspective, but it's more likely that this part of the decline is already priced in, since the dollar did decline back in November, initially when these tariffs got announced. But let me know what you guys think in the comments section of this video. I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think is likely to play out. But that does it for this video, so thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next video.